What's up everyone, it's Duncan from Overland Journals, and today is the second part of Photography Basics video series. Welcome back everyone. If you missed the first part to my Basics in Photography video series, head on over to the playlist or check the link below in the description, where in the first part I gave an overview into the video series and also talked about different types of cameras you could consider for your travel. So this series is more from a travel perspective. And also I am keeping this as basic as possible without going into too much technicalities, because a lot of those who requested for this video series are beginners or brand new into trying their hand out at photography. And if you are already been into photography and if you you've got a bit of experience and you want to add to the value of this video, you're more than welcome to leave comments in the comment section below. If you've got questions, ask questions. If you find it useful, give it a thumbs up. Now, also before we dive into today's video, if you find the content that I create on this channel of a value to you, and if you'd like to try and help me out, please head on over to my Patreon's page, link in the description below, and buy me a cup of coffee. Being a Patreon, you get certain benefits. Those are all displayed on the Patreon's page. And also, if you're new to this channel, please hit the subscription button and the notification bell, because my channel is all about sharing my experiences in overlanding with the rest of the community. And one last thing to say before I dive into the video. On my website, overland-journals.com, a little over a month ago, I launched a community content-driven forum where there's a lot of information sharing going on. It's a free sign up, so head on over to overland-journals.com and sign up. That's all you got to do, and you're part of the forum. All right, let's dive into today's video, where I'm going to touch on lenses, how to pick a lens that's suitable for your travel needs, and certain things you need to look out for. Right, so from a travel point of view, you would obviously, when you travel, you would want to do landscape photography. You might want to do a bit of portraiture, take pictures of those you are traveling with, your family, and also people that you would meet along the way. So you need a lens or lenses that will be suitable for that purpose. Now, of course, another thing you would like to do is wildlife photography, bird photography. For that, you need a pretty long zoom lens. Now, I'm going to dive into all that during the course of this video, so keep watching. Now, lenses. So let's talk about lenses and what to look out for when you're looking for a good lens. Now, I know everything is sort of limited by certain things like budget and so on, but there are good lenses for every budget out there. Now, one of the things is, once you have selected what camera you're going to go with, what brand of camera, what model of camera, something I touched on in the first part was look for a camera where you can have interchangeable lenses. What I mean by that is you can remove one lens and have another lens attached to the camera body, depending on the type of photography that you want to do. So if it is landscape, then ideally what you need is a wide angle lens, so you can get the entire landscape into your picture. So what do I mean by a wide angle? So usually the focal length of a lens is measured in millimeters. So you could look at a lens, and a wide angle lens could be 14 millimeter. Some can go even lower than that, 10 millimeters, and so on. So of course, the wider the lens can go, the price will also vary accordingly. So depending on the budget that you want, try and go as wide as you possibly can for your landscape photography. And if you want to do portraiture, which is take pictures of your family, the friends that you're traveling with, and perhaps people that you meet along the way, then a good portraiture lens would be like a 35, a 55 mil, or even an 85 mil lens. And then if you want to get pictures of birds or other wildlife, and they're not always going to be up front and close to you, then you need a zoom lens. So or a telephoto lens. So with a long focal length. A long focal length would be 200 millimeters, 300 millimeters, or even higher than that. So those are the three types of focal lengths you need to consider depending on the type of photography that you want to do. Now, of course, there are lenses that are known as zoom lenses, and there are lenses that are known as prime lenses. A zoom lens is where you get a range of focal length. You can go from wide angle to a telephoto. That's a zoom, so you can zoom between that range. And a prime lens is a lens where the focal length is fixed. So let me explain that. So on a prime lens, and if it is, let's say for example, it's a 28 millimeter or a 25 millimeter prime lens, what that means is that lens comes from the manufacturer fixed at that focal length. You can't adjust it. It's fixed at that, and that's it. Whereas with a zoom, you got room to work with. So you can, like for instance, the lens that I'm holding right now is, the wide angle is 28 millimeters, and at the long end, the telephoto lens, it's 75 millimeter. So I can zoom anywhere between those two. So I can go from wide, 28, all the way up to 75 millimeter. So the nice thing about a zoom lens is that you've got that flexibility. And from a traveling point of view, a zoom lens is the most practical kind of lens that you can have. Now, if you really want to up your game on photography and you want to get those crisp, clear pictures, then of course, in my opinion, prime lenses are the way to go, but it's not always practical. In fact, when I travel, I stick to a zoom lens. It's so much easier. And also, when you keep changing lenses while you're out there, especially for the kind of overland travel that we do, you run the risk of having dust getting into the camera and then also getting into your sensor, and that's something you don't want. So zoom lenses would be the ideal type of lens for traveling purposes. Now, so again, as I said, considering the type of photography that you want to do and also your budget, consider the type of zoom that you want. So some zooms can go from as wide as 25 mil, 28 mil, all the way up to 200 mil. Some of them, like the one I've got here, as I said, goes from 28 to 75. So that's the first thing you need to look at when you're considering a lens. Now, secondly, you need to also keep in mind and look at the f-stop of the lens. Now, this is going to get a little bit technical, but I'll explain what that means. So as you would know, the zoom is the focal length. The f-stop is how much light the lens can let in when the aperture is opened out wide. Now, the aperture determines also what's known as the depth of field, which I'll come to in a minute. So the f-stop is very important because if you're taking pictures in low light situations, could be early morning, late afternoon, or you are indoors and you need to get as much light as possible, you need to be able to open up that aperture as wide as you possibly can. Now, this lens that I've got, the f-stop is 2.8. What that means is that the aperture opens out as much as the widest it can go is 2.8. Now, this is going to be a bit confusing, but when the lower the f-stop number, so 2.8 in this case, the wider the aperture opens. So it doesn't mean when you say 2.8, it's really tiny. It's the opposite of that, right? Now you can also get lenses which are even wider, which the aperture opens up even wider than this can go. I've got another lens in my kit which goes to 1.4. That's even wider, lets in a whole heap of more light. Also, when you're looking at lenses, what you also got to look at is in some cases, in some lenses, it'll give you a f-stop, which is a range. It might range from 3.5, for example, to 5.6. Now, the difference between that type of a lens and a lens where it says f-stop 2.8, what that means is as you zoom in and out, and depending on the light conditions of the picture that you're taking, the aperture could vary between that range. So using my example, it'll range between 3.5 and 5.6. It could vary. Now, Whereas if you get a lens where the f-stop is the f-stop is fixed at 2.8 or 1.4, what that means is no matter what the conditions are, that aperture will remain opened at 2.8 if you set it to 2.8. It won't fluctuate. So sometimes you might, if you got a one that can vary, you might think you have set it to 3.5 or 2.8 or whatever, but in actual fact, when you take the picture, it could push itself up to 5.6 because it will compensate for the conditions that it's capturing. So keep that in mind. Again, the price varies between one that has got a fixed f-stop and one that can range between a certain two settings. So the price varies there as well. The price also varies depending on how wide that aperture can go. Now I'm going to give you a demo here. As I adjust the aperture, you will see the aperture opening and close. So when it goes as wide as it possibly can, then that's the widest opening, which in this case is a 2.8. So we talked about the focal range or focal length of each of the lens that you need to look at, and also the f-stop. Now, going further on f-stops, next thing I'm going to talk about is depth of field. Now, you would have seen pictures where you take a picture of a person or an object and you would see the background is completely blurred out. And that's really nice because you make the subject pop out from everything else. Now how you achieve this is if you open up your shutter or you're completely open, so 2.8 again in this example, then it's what we call a very shallow depth of field. Now, to try and demonstrate this, I'm going to try and use this example and try and picture it in your mind as I explain. So that is your aperture. So you have set it to whatever the aperture may be. So let's say 2.8, and that's the aperture that's opened up. And then all that light that's coming into and goes through, and then it hits the sensor at the back here. If you're using an old school camera, that would be your film at the back here. So light comes through, hits the sensor, and the picture gets captured or exposed. And if you picture yourself the midpoint of the sensor as the point where it captures the image, if you can just picture that, right? That's not exactly how a lens works, but just imagine that there's a spot here and everything, all the light that's coming through focuses in on that little spot. And if you draw a cone from that point going out of the lens, when the aperture is wide open, the depth of field is very wide. What that means is it goes out like that. That means only a short distance is covered in terms of focusing. I really hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, please leave it in the comments below, and I'll try and explain according to your question. Now, when you close in the aperture, so if you push your aperture all the way to say 22, it becomes like a really tight pinhole closed in. Now, that means it lets in very little light, but if you picture that cone again, with the pointy end of the cone being the sensor or the film, what that means is it's more narrower, but it travels a longer distance. I really hope this makes sense. It sounds a bit confusing, I can imagine, but I really hope it makes sense. So, having with that in mind, if you close in your aperture, so to 28 will be the maximum in most lenses, you get just about everything even behind your subject in full focus. Whereas if you open it out to 2.8 or 3.2 or whatever, then it's a lot shallower. So because of that, your background gets blurry. So that's how those blurry pictures are achieved. Now, it depends on the picture that you're taking. Like I said, if you're doing a portrait of someone or an individual or a couple or whatever, then if you want the background blurred out, the amount of depth of field that you want, or how much blurriness you want, if you keep it in simple terms, that you want behind the subject, then you've got to adjust the aperture accordingly. So if you open it out completely to 2.8, then everything's going to get blurred behind the subject. But if you keep it to about, say, 5.6 or somewhere there, then some of it will still be not as blurry as with 2.8, still visible but still blurred. However, if you want to bring everything else in the background as clear as possible as well, maybe you want to put the entire picture in context, then close in the aperture, so it's at like 22, and everything else will come in much of that will come into focus as well. And that's useful again if you're doing, for example, landscape photography and you want the entire landscape nice, sharp and clear, then you need to work with your aperture to get it nice, sharp, clear, and get all those details, get all those highlights, and get all those shadows into your picture. If you're shooting wildlife and you're on, let's say, a 300mm or a 200mm lens, and you're focusing in on a kangaroo or a bird, and you just want that subject to be clear and everything else blurred out, again, play around with your aperture. Now, one of the things you've got to be very careful with opening the aperture out completely is, depending on the lens again and the quality of the lens, the depth of field could be so shallow. Let's say you focus in on my glasses, anything beyond the front of my glasses could go blurry, so you need to keep that in mind as you play around with your camera and lenses and take pictures. You will learn those limits. So recap again. So when you're looking for a lens for your camera, keep in mind the focal length. Is that focal length suitable for the type of photography you are thinking of doing? 2, look at the aperture. Is it going to be a prime lens, or do you want to get yourself a zoom lens? My recommendation for travel purposes is get a zoom lens. And how wide can that aperture open? Is it going to be a fixed aperture lens, or is that going to vary between a certain range? And those are the characteristics you've got to look at for a lens. Now, once you've got all that figured and it all falls within your requirements and your budget, then next step obviously is to go get yourself a lens. Now, with lenses, there are 2 types of lenses you can buy. You could buy lenses that are straight out of the manufacturer. So here I've got a Sony camera, and Sony has a range of lenses that they make. Similarly with other manufacturers, Canon, Nikon, and they all have lenses that they turn out. At the same time, you can buy aftermarket generic lenses as well. Now, in fact, this lens that I've got here is not a Sony lens, it's a Tamron. Now, the 2 leading aftermarket lens manufacturers are Tamron and Sigma, and they make really good lenses, and they perform as good, and sometimes, in my opinion, even better than some of the manufacturer lenses. But they come a lot cheaper. Now, why do they come cheaper? Well, certain features which the manufacturer's lenses provides may not necessarily be available in the third-party lenses. However, it makes it more affordable. Now, I love my photography, as you know, and we use it as part of our business. And yet I've been working with these Tamron lenses rather than Sony lenses, purely because it works out a lot cheaper, and I've managed to turn out some really good looking pictures with lots of bright colors and sharpness and depth without any problems. So that's again something to keep in mind. Do your research before you go and make a commitment. Also, play around with your lenses. Experiment, practice makes perfect. The next video will be camera settings to get your exposures right, to get all your shadows right, how to compose a picture. That'll be the next video that I'll be bringing out. This particular video was purely on lenses and trying to figure out which lens is going to work for you. So I hope you found this video useful. If you liked it, please do give it a thumbs up. If you've got questions, comments, please leave them in the description below. Or head on over to the forum on overland-journals.com, and you can leave your questions in the forum as well, and I'll answer accordingly. If you haven't subscribed already, if you're still new to here, hit the subscription button and the notification bell. My channel is all about sharing my experiences in overlanding with the rest of the community, and I bring out a video every single week. Thanks for watching.